Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. We do so by painting an accurate picture of that journey from the perspective of the justice-involved individual. Too often, our perceptions of those individuals are tainted by media-driven caricatures created to sell newspapers or movie tickets. This adds little to a healthy dialogue as to how to best address criminality and the reintegration process. This podcast avoids stereotypes and biases in favor of the lived experiences of those we can best learn from. Now, please, welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello and welcome to episode 79 of the Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. I am so pleased to let you know that friend of the program, Dr. Jerrod Brown of Concordia University in St. Paul, Minnesota, will be joining us once again today. Jerrod Brown, PhD, is a professor, trainer, researcher, and consultant with multiple years of experience teaching collegiate courses. Jerrod is currently an assistant professor, program director, and lead developer for the Master of Arts degree in Human Services with an emphasis in forensic behavioral health and a second emphasis area in trauma, resilience, and self-care strategies for Concordia University in St. Paul. In addition to this experience, Jerrod has also provided consultation services to a number of caregivers, professionals, and organizations pertaining to topics related to autism spectrum disorder, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, confabulation, suggestibility, trauma and other life adversities, traumatic brain injury, as well as youth fire setting. Jerrod has also conducted numerous trainings for professional and student audiences. Jerrod is founder and CEO of the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies, also known as AFIS, and he is editor-in-chief of Forensic Scholars Today. Dr. Brown has completed 4 separate master's degree programs and holds graduate certificates in autism spectrum disorder, other health disabilities, and traumatic brain injuries. Jerrod has published several articles and book chapters. He is a wealth of information, and as I mentioned, no stranger to the show. He first appeared with us back in episode 64, at which time he gave us a broad overview of trauma. We then kicked off his 3-part trauma trilogy, beginning with episode 69. If you are passionate as to trauma-informed care and or wish to learn more as to that very important topic, do yourselves a favor and check out the trauma trilogy that Dr. Brown brought to us in earlier episodes. He is here to talk with us today as to the topic of autism. More to the point, autism in our criminal justice populations. Another example of the importance of the responsivity principle, really drilling down a bit today into a specific responsivity consideration. Hey, let's hear from our friend, Dr. Jerrod Brown, and I will see you all on the other side. We are so pleased to be welcoming back Dr. Jerrod Brown of Concordia University in St. Paul. Loyal listeners of the show, of course, know that Jerrod is a friend of the show. He has been on the program in the past multiple times talking about a variety of topics, although of late, we've really been drilling down with Jerrod on the topic of trauma. Jerrod completed a fantastic 3-part trauma trilogy. If you're interested in that interplay between trauma and justice-involved individuals. Go back and track those episodes down. Jerrod is with us here today to talk about populations who may fall into the autism population, and we're going to talk all about autism in the criminal justice system, some tips for practitioners, and some frequently asked questions, if you will. So why don't we start out, Jerrod, with you just giving us, broadly speaking, what are the signs and symptoms of autism?
You bet. Thank you, Joe, for having me back. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in today. So if you're working in the criminal justice system, you're probably starting to come into contact or become more familiar with the topic of autism. Not always as a perpetrator, but a victim of a crime. This topic has significant implications for eyewitness testimony as well. So really consider that when we talk about these topics today. So at the core of having an autism diagnosis is going to be the social communication deficits and restrictive, repetitive patterns of behavior. When we think of like social skill deficits, it is very common for this population to struggle with just social interactions, how they relate to other people, how they process social information. In some cases, this population could come off as very shy. It's not uncommon for some individuals on the spectrum to also be dealing with a higher level of social anxiety. So keep that in your mind anytime you're interviewing someone on the spectrum. In some cases, this population may have some self-expression deficits. That could be nonverbal. That could be verbal. So really slow down the pace of the interview you're doing or whatever type of thing you're doing. If you're a probation officer, a police officer, a clinician. In some cases, too, the individual may have some just unusual kind of fixated, ritualistic interest. And it really depends on what that is. It could be related to food. There's plenty of literature that talks about just this population really being picky eaters. When you think of restrictive and repetitive types of behaviors, this population could, in some cases, really struggle with cognitive rigidity. So if you're not familiar with that term, the person maybe gets stuck on a particular topic, a particular person, a particular object, and they become really maybe fixated on that. So they can have some narrow interest in some cases. In some cases, too, really being aware that some persons with autism might place an emphasis on sameness, like just doing the same thing over and over and over and over again. In other cases, they may have more recurring movements, so being aware of how this could impact body movements as well. So there's a lot of different things to think about. From that social lens, I think this is a big factor as to why some people with autism do come into contact with the criminal justice system. And I do want to preface that the overwhelming majority of people with autism are law-abiding citizens, but there is a minority of individuals that will come into contact. And if we look at the prevalence rates of autism, they have gone up significantly in the past several decades. I believe right now the general prevalence rate for autism is around 1 in 58, 1 in 59, depending on the study you look at. But back to the social skill deficits, I think this is a big, important component for your listeners to really be aware of, regardless of what field of study they're in. In some cases, let's say you're doing the interview, the person with autism with these social skill deficits could come off as self-centered in some cases. So you really want to be aware of that. They could come off as just not interested in the conversation. Now, pretend if this is a defendant in the courtroom and they come off as self-centered, they're uninterested, maybe they come off as like callous or aloof, and the courts don't understand autism, or the person may have not had an accurate diagnosis. That can be very detrimental within a court setting. If you're doing a pre-sentence investigation, really consider these things, because on face value, the client may look like they're self-centered, checked out, not interested, but is there something else going on? Could there be deficits going on with this person? So I encourage people to always stay just curious, dig deeper, learn more. This population is not uncommon to show some unusual differences in eye contact. I've seen it go both ways. Very limited eye contact or staring for long periods of time. If you are walking with a person with autism in some cases or sitting next to them, they may have difficulty understanding body space, personal awareness. They may stand too close to the interviewer or too far away. So those are just a few things to be aware of. When we think too, at the core of this is those social communication deficits. So again, the person may have a difficult time initiating that conversation, sustaining the conversation. I've even seen some clients really struggle with ending the conversation. So knowing how to wrap it up can be a struggle in some cases. There's something also called pragmatic language. It's important for your viewers to be aware of. That's the use of language in social situations. Regardless if you're working with someone with autism or not, if you can understand pragmatic language, you're going to have a better understanding of why some people struggle in the social arena. But when people deal with pragmatic language impairments, again, that could impact relationship forming, friendship making abilities, how people interpret nonverbal cues. It can relate to standing too close to another person, too much eye contact. All of those things can be really, really challenging for some people on the autism spectrum. But it's also very important for folks to know that a very high percentage of people with autism are also going to have co-occurring diagnoses, very common for anxiety, as I mentioned before. It's not uncommon to have ADHD. But there's also a host of physical health issues that this population is often prone to. Very high rates of sleep disturbances in this population, as well as digestive health issues. Why should you care about that if you're a criminal justice professional? Because sleep deprivation in and of itself, if someone is chronically sleep deprived, that can impact decision making, problem solving, communication. There's tons of research, not just on the autism literature, but people who are chronically sleep deprived. That could be a factor in impulsivity, irritability, aggressive type behaviors in some cases. And then the digestive health component is why should you care about that? Because when digestive health is off, that oftentimes can impact emotional and behavioral health. So there's a big connection between the gut and the brain. And then also, it is very common too for this population to be dealing with issues related to sensory processing. They may be very hypersensitive to certain things. So like in an interviewing room, is there a lot of clutter on the wall? Bright lights, certain sounds, certain smells, maybe it's cologne, perfume. They can become reactive in those situations. In other cases, again, they may have that sensitivity to food. I know there's some literature that talks about dental health issues in this population. So there's a lot of factors to take into account. And when you bring this up, Joe, what are the signs and symptoms? This is really an 8-hour discussion that we're having in just a few minutes. So we're really scratching the surface with some of this stuff.
Yeah, I understand that 100%, Jerrod. Let me ask you, when you were speaking, you mentioned social skills deficits, which we talk a lot about cognitive behavioral interventions on this program. And for those practitioners who are familiar with those cognitive behavioral interventions, we talk about problem-solving skills, cognitive restructuring, but we talk a lot about teaching and training on what we refer to as social skills. Now, you also mentioned cognitive rigidity. So let me ask, I don't know the answer to this question, but is this when you note social skills deficits, is that an area that can be targeted? Is that dynamic, or is it more just something to be aware of?
You absolutely need to be aware of it, and it should be a target. So difficulty communicating with others, absolutely a challenge. And that can lead to relationship breakdowns, or it can lead to loneliness where the person has a real hard time making friends or keeping friends. Unfortunately, this population is very prone to being bullied and teased while in school. Within that environment, if the person's sitting in a jail or a holding cell or in a courtroom or in an interview room, in some cases, they may have a real difficult time processing and integrating that information from the environment they're in. So it can create some ongoing stress or confusion. It can really be a struggle too with kind of the give and take relationship. Like they may, in some cases, it can come off as like one-sided or selfish, or it's all about them, where they don't understand that give and take, like how to ask questions. Now, the question comes up too when we talk about this sometimes when I give talks on this, about the topic of empathy. And there is some research to show that this population may have some empathy-related deficits. Other research shows that they may not necessarily have true empathy deficits, but they just express empathy in a different way. And a core issue that this population deals with is something called theory of mind. This is a really important topic for your viewers to be aware of. Theory of mind relates to that client's ability to understand the internal mental states of other people. It's kind of like mind reading, perspective taking, just being able to read the audience, predict the future a little bit, knowing that maybe this person doesn't have my best intentions in mind, and maybe I should not be friends with them. So it does relate to deception detection. There is some literature on the general theory of mind literature that talks about people lower theory of minds may be more suggestible, and we know suggestibility, if introduced into the criminal justice system, can lead to a host of issues, including miscarriages of justice. Transitioning from one topic to another, or from one new learning task to another, can be very challenging for this population. So when you do a skills group, a COGS group, is that person placed in a group with a facilitator who has advanced training in neurodevelopmental disorders and language impairment and social limitations and theory of mind? Or is the person placed into a group where they're in a group with other people that don't have these similar issues, and they're all in the same group going through the same curriculum? That might be challenging, because we need to adapt and modify our approaches with this population because of some of the things I'm talking about today. But another big component of this too is that it's very common for folks with autism to have executive functioning impairments. And executive function drives the bus with behavior. It's the boss of the brain, the CEO of the brain. So at the very least, if you're running a COG skills group, try to understand autism. Try to understand these deficits, understand perspective taking. Maybe the client wouldn't do well in that group setting right away. Maybe it's one-on-one, kind of getting a feel for the person's strengths, limitations. Maybe it's a referral to a specialist who can do a comprehensive evaluation to give you a good report and recommendations that, hey, this client might be really gullible and suggestible or naive. They might not do well in a COG skills group with other individuals who might be more high functioning. So we really need to modify that. But yes, I think targeting social skills, absolutely important. Couple ways to target social skills with this population. Something called video modeling. I would recommend your viewers looking at that. Something called social stories. You can Google that. When you teach theory of mind, there's something called thought bubble training. But anything you can do that helps them increase self-awareness, perspective taking, insight, doing things that are repetitious, role-playing, maybe using a short video and then talking about what they saw and then practicing it in day-to-day life is very, very helpful. Because what can happen if you practice these skills in a group within a controlled setting, they may learn that within that group, but have they truly learned how to apply that into everyday life? And that's where there's a disconnect a lot. So practicing these skills in everyday life is imperative as well.
And when you're responding and articulating the issues around placement in cognitive groups among well-intentioned practitioners, it really, I feel, speaks to the need of more education, more training on this topic of autism. Great job talking about the signs and symptoms of autism. Maybe let's back up a little bit. What are some reasons why persons with autism become involved in the criminal justice system?
Well, they are many and varied. And again, most are law-abiding citizens, but some do come into contact with the justice system. If you go deep into this research literature, looking at that social skill component obviously is a driving factor. Interpersonal naivete. They don't know how to read the situation. They're gullible in some cases. They're talked into doing things that absolutely are not in their best interest. If they're dealing with some empathy deficits, that could be a factor as well. Reduced theory of mind is a factor to consider. If that client misinterprets or misses social or emotional cues, they may misread that situation, and that could be a factor too. High levels of impulsivity absolutely need to be considered. There is some literature too that's looked at violent behavior among people with autism, and some of that literature points to the fact that in some cases, if a client with autism enters the justice system for violent-related reasons, do they have reduced frustration or distress tolerance? That needs to be absolutely taken into account. I think impairments with coping or change are a driving factor in some cases, particularly in stressful situations. For someone with autism, change, uncertainty, worry, fear, and lots of stress are not a good thing. Uncontrolled conduct too, where they just don't know how to put on the brakes and pause and reflect. But a big part too, I've seen this with some cases I've consulted on, confusion and frustration have resulted in that person becoming overloaded sensory-wise, and then they act out. Their intent was not to hurt anybody or hurt themselves or do anything like illegal, but they became so overwhelmed and so frustrated and so confused, they started acting out, and people who didn't understand what was going on called 911. The police arrived. What happens if that person grew up in a home too where there's a lot of dysfunction? They have trauma histories on top of this, or they have some untreated mental health issues, chronic sleep deprivation. Maybe they're dealing with tons of body pain because of digestive health issues. And rumination is quite common too in this population. So again, the reasons for this are many and varied, but those are just a few of the factors you'd want to consider.
What are some of the best practices for, and you sort of alluded to this already, Jerrod, but some best practices for interviewing persons with autism in the criminal justice setting?
Well, first and foremost, anyone you're interviewing, what are their strengths? What are their limitations? What are their needs? Just because you're interviewing someone, let's say, who's 20 years old chronologically, that doesn't mean their brain functions at that level. Maybe they have a brain and a cognitive functioning capability of a 12-year-old. So are you matching your approaches to their cognitive and emotional functioning capabilities? For example, if you're interviewing someone and you're not modifying the vocabulary you're using, if you're starting to engage in rapid-fire questioning, that can be very challenging. Any changes in routine, if the person is interviewed in an unfamiliar place, if they're interviewed in a room with bright lights or a lot of noise, those can all be really problematic factors. We also need to consider their language capability. And this can apply to any person you're interviewing, but how does that individual communicate? Some people with autism may be more nonverbal. Do they communicate with more gestures? Do they use words that don't match the situation? What happens if the person has a listening problem? Maybe there's some hearing deficit going on and no one's ever detected, but the person's never said anything to anyone, and they're only catching every other word in the interview, and they don't tell the interviewer, I don't understand what you're saying, but they give the outward cue of agreeing to something. Maybe they had no idea what they just agreed to. Can that person follow directions? In some cases, maybe the person has some difficult time naming objects, faces, things, people, those kind of things. That can be a significant implication for eyewitness testimony. And I think really important too for interviewers to be aware of that in some cases, people with autism may have unusual facial expressions. So they could come off as very expressionless, where it's just very hard to tell if this person is happy or sad. They look maybe indifferent in some cases. They may come off in other cases. They could be very insensitive to other people's feelings. That is not their intent. That's a core issue for theory of mind. Maybe the empathy kind of limitations, or they have some unusual mannerisms or that excessive eye contact, those kind of things. Other cases too, are they laughing at inappropriate times that don't match the situation? Are they crying at inappropriate times that just don't match the situation at hand? So when you see those things, dig deeper. Could there be something else going on? And other things too, research has found that this population may be more compliant than other populations. So what is compliance? Compliance would be the client with autism on the outside agrees with the interviewer, but internally they don't agree, but they're just going along with the interviewer because that person's in a position of power. Maybe they're in a uniform and they don't want to make that person mad and they really want to please that person. So they go along with everything they say. That's compliance. There are some articles, research, just anecdotal accounts too, that point to the fact that some individuals with autism may be more naive or gullible. So when you look at naivete, really think of like inexperience in life. Maybe they're lacking wisdom, lacking judgment, lacking sophistication. Those can be really problematic factors, especially if that person's brought into the criminal justice system. And when we think of gullibility too, are they easily persuaded to believe something that there may not be a lot of evidence to believe, but they just go along with it? Are they easily like fooled or cheated, or they're just overly trusting of people they shouldn't? Those are some indications too of lower levels of social intelligence. Highly recommend your audience to also learn about social and emotional intelligence. But then what about the topic of acquiescence? That's another big topic when we're talking about interviewing. If you're not familiar with the term acquiescence, that's going to be more of a client that said like it's yassing. They're just going along with stuff. They have that tendency to agree with the interviewer regardless of the content. And it kind of relates to conformity too. And again, if the person who's interviewing is in that position of power, maybe the person is really fearful or they seek social like contact with other people. Those are just a few things to think about when we talk about acquiescence. So again, Joe, I mean, we could keep going. If you want me to go deeper into those topics, I sure can.
Why don't we do this, Jerrod? Let's maybe broaden the scope of that previous question and take it beyond best practices for interviewing persons with autism in the criminal justice system. You noted those topics around compliance, gullibility. Let's just ask this question. What else in general should criminal justice practitioners be aware of as to autism in the populations they serve, whether that's correctional, law enforcement, again, just any sort of 101 autism for the CJ practitioner out there wanting to be better equipped with their knowledge base here?
Time management comes to mind. I can think of a few cases I've consulted on where the person really struggled with time management. Do they understand the use of time? Do they understand what a day, a week, a month, a year really looks like and feels like? If they don't, that can absolutely be a critical component to the interviewing process, and it may result in collecting information from that person that may be inaccurate or partially inaccurate. Theory of mind, again, I think study that topic. Many of the things I'm talking about, Joe, today are going to be absolutely helpful when interviewing any human being, especially a person that has some limitations. Understand theory of mind deficits. When someone has theory of mind deficits, again, they might have some difficult time making accurate judgments about the mental states of other people. And this could really reduce their ability to understand that social situation, that social context, and it can absolutely contribute to more confusion and distress for that person. There's another term called weak central coherence. It's a core issue with people on the autism spectrum as well. Most of the time when I give these talks, people have never heard that term. It's called weak central coherence. And when someone deals with weak central coherence, it's really, they're going to be more hyper-focused on one particular thing. They're going to have a real difficult time seeing the big picture. So they can't see the forest through the trees. So they have a difficult time inferring the larger meaning from many details. And I think part of that too, I would absolutely weave in abstract reasoning. When you're interviewing this population, working with this population, making things concrete as possible, avoiding sarcasm, avoiding like slang terms, like looks like it's raining cats and dogs outside, making it concrete, those kind of things. I think it's also very, very important to be aware of the topic of alexithymia. That's a really critical component to working with anyone that has a neurodevelopmental disorder. And alexithymia is actually quite common among people with major depressive disorder, trauma histories, traumatic brain injuries, but it is very common among people with autism as well. Alexithymia is more of a personality characteristic. So it's been referred to like emotional blindness, where the client's going to have a difficult time verbalizing their emotions or describing their emotions or identifying and decoding their own emotions. Why should you care about that? Because if you ask your client, how are you feeling today? And you can tell they're in distress. Someone with true alexithymia may say, I'm doing great, because they have a hard time labeling their emotions. They have a hard time labeling and understanding that I feel mad right now. I feel depressed. It oftentimes comes out sideways. So if someone has true alexithymia, when they're under a lot of distress, it may come out sideways as more somatic symptoms. So more headaches, back pain, stomach pain, fatigue, sleep problems, those kind of things. Anytime you're interviewing anyone, I think very important, especially with this population, auditory communication, auditory processing deficits, slow down the pace of the interview, fact check, verify. They may need more time to take in the question you ask them, so be okay with silence. And one other thing I'll just say for your audience too is something called sluggish cognitive tempo. This is an interesting topic, Joe. We should do a talk on sometime. It came out of the ADHD literature. It's called sluggish cognitive tempo. It looks a lot like inattentive ADHD, but they've studied it within the context of many disorders. And there is some research to show that some people with autism may have sluggish cognitive tempo. Why should you care about that? Because if someone has true sluggish cognitive tempo, what would that look like? It's going to look like excessive daydreaming in some cases, blank staring. Maybe the client becomes lost in their own thoughts. You ask a question, they answer half of it, and they just become very blank and spacey. They come off as apathetic. They may come off as very sluggish and bored and unmotivated and drowsy and confused. It can impact their moving abilities too, how they just walk. If you don't understand this topic and you've seen clients like this, which I suspect you have, and I've seen a lot of clients like this, I don't know how many have true sluggish cognitive tempo, but don't jump to the conclusions that the client is just being lazy or they just don't want to do something. Could there be something else going on at a deeper level that's causing these symptoms and behavioral mannerisms?
Sluggish cognitive tempo, as well as theory of mind, listeners. Two topics that you will more than likely hear Dr. Brown return to the program to speak of. Hey, Jerrod, as long as you are here, why don't we take the opportunity to allow you to give a shout out to your new graduate programs at Concordia University in trauma, resilience, and self-care, both the master's online program as well as the accompanying graduate certificate program.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you, Joe. So Concordia launched a Master of Arts in Human Services with an emphasis in trauma, resilience, and self-care strategies in September of 2021, so new program. And there's two components to that. People can go through the full master's or they can take the graduate level certificate. The graduate level certificate is the first 5 classes. Each class is 3 credits. It's 100% online degree. Anyone in the world with a computer, internet access, who meets the requirements and goes through the application process, in theory, could take the program. It is a non-clinical program, so you're not going to go through this. It's not a licensure. This program is very practical. Obviously, we're going to synthesize the complicated research, but it's really geared toward the helping professional. So I'm often asked, who are the people that sign up for this? Probation officers, mental health folks. Maybe it's a mental health person who's already licensed, but they work with a lot of people with trauma and they just want to know more about trauma. People that are working in the social service arena. We've had people in here that are working with at-risk individuals. Could be domestic violence shelter workers, homeless outreach centers, people working with juveniles in the justice system. So basically, if you're working with people in the helping professions, you are probably coming into contact with clients impacted by trauma on a regular basis. So this program is going to teach you about the adverse childhood experiences research, complex developmental trauma, domestic violence, child abuse, trauma-informed care, resilience, self-care strategies, the post-traumatic stress disorder, the impact trauma has on the criminal justice system, the impact it has on the family systems, the impact it has on special needs populations like autism. We have a couple weeks just dedicated to that. So you're going to walk away understanding the complex research. You're going to get a lot of resources, and hopefully you'll be in a better position to work with, support, recognize, understand people impacted by trauma. And this program is even more important, in my opinion, right now when we look through the lens of COVID too. COVID's really amplified almost everything I'm talking about today. COVID is a collective trauma. And we are, without a doubt, if you look at the research coming out, seeing significant increases in various forms of trauma directly and indirectly caused by COVID. So there's a few things to think about, Joe, but I think it's a good program. We got a great lineup. My good friend and I, Janina Schick, put it together with help of a lot of other people. And yeah, we're really proud of it and definitely look forward for all of you to sign up.
If either of those programs have piqued your interest, I will leave a link in the episode show notes of this podcast episode. I'll also leave Jerrod's email if you have questions of him regarding the program or any of the content you have heard today. I know Jerrod's always willing to inform and educate others. Jerrod, I won't say goodbye because as a friend of the show, I know you'll be back. So rather than say goodbye, I'll simply say, until next time, my friend.
I hate saying goodbye, so thank you for saying that. And thank you, everyone. Thank you, Joe, for allowing me back on your fantastic program.
Thanks, Jerrod. We'll see you next time. As noted, and we have teased this a little bit before, Jerrod will be back in future episodes, not necessarily for a full-blown interview as you heard today, but rather for an ongoing, semi-regular portion of the program that we are referring to as Trauma Talk with Dr. Jerrod Brown. Trauma Talk, Trauma Talk, Trauma Talk, Trauma Talk, Trauma Talk. Hey, quick reminder, I am now a brand ambassador for Make Time Count Today. Make Time Count Today is a United Kingdom-based social enterprise looking to grow here in the United States. They have developed a platform that connects vulnerable people with local services and does so much more. We really believe our platform can have a massive impact for service providers that are trying to support vulnerable people in the community. We connect users with an ecosystem of support, including mentors and family members. They get a shared calendar, there's a chat feature, and a service directory for self-referrals. For agencies using the platform, they can manage clients, manage staff, and all interventions all in one place. We enable easy referral from local authorities to multiple support agencies, and each intervention is tracked via 360 feedback. Lots more I could say about Make Time Count Today. Reach out with any questions you may have. In the meantime, we will be back next week with a fresh episode. You may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, theparagongroup.llc.com, for training or presentations as to evidence-based practices, or, of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to connect to the show via our email of thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. The Criminologist Media Group is also on Twitter. Give us a follow at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. You can also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn, and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. Merchandise is available if you're looking for a fridge magnet or a ballpoint pen emblazoned with the Criminologist logo. Reach out for merchandise. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word. Tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us. Ask them to subscribe to the podcast. And of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them. There's only us. Remember to woo outtake.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.
The thoughts, statements, and opinions of the host and cast members do not necessarily reflect the views of their employers and are those of the host and cast themselves. Any discussion regarding client statements, behaviors, actions, or crimes are purely fictional and are used only for the purposes of example. Any examples that could be deemed to be related to an actual individual or individuals are incidental.